Giving a Star Wars game a title like The Force Unleashed is a bold step. You're making a promise with a title like that. You're saying that not only will the player be able to use the Force, they will be able to use it in a way that goes well beyond anything we've seen before. LucasArts set itself a high bar with the Force Unleashed title, and yet it cleared that bar with ease. The Force Unleashed and its sequel are action games where the power of the Force is literally unleashed, almost without restriction. In fact, it could even have a colon in the title for extra emphasis: The Force Unleashed. Back in 2005, LucasArts had this crazy idea that an action game where you play as a powerful Force wielder should be a power trip and fun to play, even if that meant turning a blind eye to some minor inconsistencies when it comes to established canon. LucasArts also wanted an impactful story that did something a little different to Star Wars games that had come before, so it made the protagonist a powerful dark side Force user who would eventually question his upbringing and kickstart the rebellion. It did all this while puffing out Darth Vader's story and showing how the infamous Sith Lord was never happy playing second fiddle to the Emperor, even before Luke came along. Again, there are inconsistencies with the movies if you look for them, but I would rather get swept along in an exciting story that has a few minor contradictions than plod through one that is consistent with what came before, but dull and predictable as a result. Which brings me to Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, the new Star Wars game from Respawn. While most people seem to enjoy it, I found the whole experience rather dull and spent the entire time wishing I was playing Force Unleashed 3 instead. I also found Fallen Order to be the embodiment of much of Disney's new Star Wars content, and I now long for the days when developers had a little more creative freedom to express themselves in the Star Wars universe. The Force Unleashed feels like a bunch of unrestrained developers saw the Force powers as something exciting that would make for a great video game.
Well, what if we really jacked it up? What if we unleashed it and delivered a Force experience that people hadn't seen before?
The basic premise, Hayden speaks to this all the time and he makes us all say it in every meeting. You know, what's the premise of the game? Kicking someone's ass with the Force.
What is the core gameplay?
Kicking someone's ass with the Force.
Jedi Fallen Order, on the other hand, feels like the developers were burdened by the potential of the Force, squeezing it in because they had to rather than because they wanted to. At the risk of glorifying game development too much, I got the impression from playing The Force Unleashed that the developers had always wanted to make this game, and they leapt on the opportunity when it was presented. Playing Jedi Fallen Order, I got the impression the developers had been told to make the game and did the best they could in the time available. Both the story and gameplay of Fallen Order felt safe and formulaic. While the lightsaber combat was probably the best it's ever been, the collection of Force powers was incredibly underwhelming, with basic things such as push and pull being restricted to late game abilities, and you couldn't use them much in combat due to an incredibly restrictive Force meter that you consumed even doing lightsaber specific moves. The characters were inoffensive and bland, not annoying but hardly endearing either, and the story was predictable and boring. You don't have to be a huge Star Wars fan to know how Cal's quest to uncover info about a group of Force-sensitive children will go, bearing in mind it takes place between episodes 3 and 4. And yeah, I guess there are story spoilers for Jedi Fallen Order in here, but I honestly wouldn't worry about those. I started to wonder whether the old nostalgia goggles were clouding my judgment, so I went back to play Force Unleashed 1 and 2, and despite both games having a lot of flaws, in fact across the two games you can criticise nearly every element of what makes up a video game, I do still stand by my original claim. The Force Unleashed games are simply more fun and more interesting than Jedi Fallen Order, and I believe this is the direct result of Disney's takeover and aggressive control of the franchise, when compared to the looser touch taken by LucasArts under George Lucas. Instead of drip feeding out Force powers so slowly that you have to wait 10 hours to pull a rope towards you, Force Unleashed has you shooting lightning bolts from your dark side fingertips within minutes. Instead of a story that has you spending the entire game moving from planet to planet looking for a MacGuffin that you then decide not to use, Force Unleashed tells the story of what inspired the rebels to fight in the first place, with the end result feeling like it has filled in a gap in the timeline instead of providing a tiny bit of extra detail about something that is ultimately superfluous anyway. To make a comparison to the movies, The Force Unleashed is Rogue One. Not only does it tell a cool story, it explains why there was a weak spot in the original Death Star, which was previously something that seemed like a tacky plot contrivance. Jedi Fallen Order is Solo. It tells a story that never needed telling and doesn't add anything interesting to the world or characters. Now, all that said, playing the Force Unleashed games did make me appreciate just how difficult it is to create a game where you have all those powers, and I now sympathise with Respawn and Jedi Fallen Order a little more. The comparison between The Force Unleashed and Fallen Order perfectly illustrates a wider issue Disney has faced since purchasing the Star Wars IP from George Lucas for $4 billion. Namely that much of the content outside the new trilogy feels rather dull, lifeless and frankly unnecessary, with the reason for this likely being the desire to keep all stories told across all media part of the official canon. Shortly after the acquisition, Disney announced that with the exception of the 6 movies and the Clone Wars television show, all existing Star Wars stories, which number in the hundreds if not thousands if you include all the books, comics and games, would be relegated to legend status. Disney even established a formal story group to ensure future stories wouldn't contradict each other. Shame that group didn't also insist the movies were planned out in advance, but that's another story. Disney's decision didn't eradicate those stories, and most continue to be actively sold in some form. However, many fans were understandably upset that their favourite characters, including post-original trilogy newcomers like Mara Jade and Grand Admiral Thrawn from the books and Old Republic classics like Revan from the games, were no longer considered canon. Personally, I wasn't upset or annoyed by Disney's decision to make the old stories non-canon. I was actually quite excited by it because of the potential for a bunch of high quality new stories that would connect across media and develop characters for those who wanted to immerse themselves in the world of Star Wars more than the average fan. Disney's decision was also perfectly understandable given the state of the Star Wars extended universe at the time it acquired the IP. Firstly, any attempt to keep the existing stories in place would have placed a ridiculous number of constraints on the new movies, and the movies are the big money makers. The movies will always come first. The extended universe included a bunch of stories that took place after the end of the movies and saw major events such as Luke getting cloned and married, Han and Leia having a bunch of kids who then grew up to have stories of their own, and even the return of Palpatine, if you can believe such a ridiculous notion. Disney could never have developed new movies based on this existing canon without alienating 99% of the audience. Even the old books faced problems trying to keep readers up to date on events. For example, at the beginning of Jedi Search, the first book of the Jedi Academy trilogy, there's a big info dump about the whole Thrawn situation, plus how Luke nearly went to the dark side when Palpatine returned. It's awkward enough to read even as someone who already knows those stories. Now multiply that by 100 as the movies attempt to bring everyone up to speed on everything they've missed out on by not reading the books, and you can understand the problem. And attempts to make movies based on the existing stories would have likely failed too. Take the infamous Thrawn trilogy by Timothy Zahn, which is a favourite amongst most fans of the books. The story is good, albeit perhaps not quite as good as often described, but there's no way this book trilogy would work as a movie trilogy. Even putting aside the obvious problem concerning the ages of Ford, Fisher and Hamill for a story that takes place just after the original trilogy, you still have crucial issues like how the big bad, i.e. Thrawn, never actually meets the heroes. The second book is also fairly dull. Thrawn is a great character and he certainly impacts the story and drives the plot forward, but the lack of direct conflict between him and the main three would be an issue for a trilogy of movies. There's also a bunch of other factors, like many of the extended universe stories being fairly bad if not outright terrible, or having many of them contradict each other to such an extent that fans had to create a hierarchy of canon to resolve disputes. Again, taking the Thrawn trilogy as an example, those books were initially published between 1991 and 1993, which the observant among you will know is before the prequels. As such, when the books referenced events such as the Clone Wars, they did so with no real knowledge of what the Clone Wars would end up being in the movies, or the role Anakin would play in them. Fortunately, the legend stories, as they are now called, still exist, and many of them can be read as if they were still canon, at least until Disney outright does something to contradict them. One of my favourite stories, Darth Plagueis, appears to be largely unaffected by Disney's new content for the time being, although I think there might be comics I haven't got to yet which start messing with this one a bit. The Darth Bane trilogy and much of the Old Republic stuff is largely untouched, including KOTOR. Revan has even been written into canon through the visual dictionary accompaniment to The Rise of Skywalker. With the Star Wars franchise being in a slightly awkward place right now, I imagine a fair few of you are disenchanted with the whole thing, so with that in mind, I thought it would be cool to get some recommendations going in the comments. If there are any Star Wars stories, new or old, that you love, give them a shout out in the comments and upvote other people's recommendations as appropriate. We might be able to get a cool reading list of sorts going. For old legend stories, I'm going to recommend the aforementioned Darth Plagueis, which manages the incredible feat of making the prequels better, as well as being a good story in its own right. For new canon, I'm going to recommend Dark Disciple, a story featuring Asajj Ventress set around the time of the Clone Wars, as the Jedi attempt to assassinate Count Dooku. I haven't actually finished this one yet, but I'm enjoying what I've read so far. The comics are also really good, so get yourself a Marvel Unlimited subscription for a month and check them out. Anyway, I must admit Disney probably did the right thing in creating a new set of canon stories, and I was excited for them. Things started off promisingly enough with solid books such as Tarkin and Lords of the Sith, and Disney even brought back popular characters like Thrawn, albeit not in exactly the same way that fans knew him. However, what I was really waiting for was Aftermath, the first book to be set after Return of the Jedi. As we know, The Force Awakens introduced a bunch of mysteries, and I read Aftermath and its sequels closely, trying to pick out hints for all the big questions, such as who is Snoke and what's the deal with the Knights of Ren. All in all, and despite the flaws with The Force Awakens, this was probably the happiest I'd ever been as a Star Wars fan. 2 years later, it all fell apart, and the desire to keep all content strictly canon was beginning to look like a misstep. As became clear with the dreadful The Last Jedi and was confirmed with the entertaining but unbelievably messy The Rise of Skywalker, Disney didn't have the whole trilogy planned out in advance at all, meaning it was impossible for authors to include hints at the big mysteries in the books. No one knew the answers to the questions posed by J.J. Abrams in The Force Awakens, not even J.J. Abrams. And yes, this may seem rather predictable. We are talking about the mind behind Lost after all. Perhaps the most infamous example of mystery box storytelling where the creator didn't have a clue how he would answer his own questions. However, I assumed Disney would have been a little more astute than that. It wasn't. Perhaps the more pertinent problem faced by those trying to tell Star Wars stories, be they in books, comics or eventually games, is that they are heavily restricted in the types of stories they can tell and how interesting those stories can be. For example, Bloodline, a story centred on Leia a few years before The Force Awakens, has to dodge most references to Ben Solo and his Jedi training with Luke because no one knew how that was going to play out at the time of release. The book seems to imply that the Jedi massacre hadn't happened yet, but you can tell the author left this deliberately vague because at the time of writing it hadn't been established when Ben Solo would become Kylo Ren. Then there's a book about Luke set between episodes 4 and 5, which is inherently predictable, and much of the lustre around Thrawn is removed when you place him in the years before A New Hope, and therefore strip him of the potential to make much impact. Obviously, a lot of people are enjoying the new stories, be they in movies, television shows, books, comics or games, and with the exception of The Last Jedi, I completely understand that. It just feels like something is missing, especially in video games where we have only 2 Battlefront games, only one of which has a story, Fallen Order, a VR game and some portable gambling machines. Playing Fallen Order and then replaying the Force Unleashed games really hit home how much I would have preferred a Force Unleashed 3 game over Jedi Fallen Order, even if that would have sent shockwaves through Disney's story group. Frankly, even the ideas that LucasArts eventually abandoned were more interesting than Jedi Fallen Order. LucasArts considered making a game where you would play as Darth Maul, or a Wookiee freedom fighter, but it eventually settled on the idea of playing as Starkiller, a powerful dark side Force user and secret apprentice to Darth Vader. Starkiller was envisioned as a darker Luke Skywalker, with the story designed to resemble what might have happened if Luke had joined up with Vader at the end of The Empire Strikes Back and killed the Emperor to become a Sith Lord. As with Shadow of the Empire back in 1996, LucasArts designed The Force Unleashed as a connected multimedia project to capture the imaginations of all Star Wars fans, not just those interested in video games. In addition to the main game release, there were different versions of the game for older consoles and handhelds, a tie-in novel and comic book, sets of toys and miniatures, plus a role-playing supplement. Starkiller even cameos in Soul Calibur 4. This cross-media status elevated The Force Unleashed beyond most video game adaptations or other expanded universe content, and crucially it meant that George Lucas himself would be involved. After approving the initial story outline, Lucas helped the team with core parts of the story, such as offering guidance on the relationship between Vader and Starkiller, which he felt would be based on fear and not support. Lucas also added Juno Eclipse, Starkiller's love interest throughout both games, because he thought the initial draft lacked a personal connection for Starkiller. He even gave the team the name Juno Eclipse, which was the original name of Asajj Ventress from the Clone Wars series. Perhaps most importantly, Lucas also gave his permission to the developers' ideas for where the story would go, and he wasn't overly precious concerning the use of core characters. After finalising the story outline, the team sent a list of questions to Lucas, such as, can we use Princess Leia? And they were pleasantly surprised to receive approvals across the board.
In the grip of fear.
Because of George's schedule, we had to actually put the story and the outline in a memo form to George.
There was a day when, we heard that the fax was coming and everybody rushed around the fax machine.
We just stood there looking at the fax machine, waiting for it to come out.
And the pages start coming through and then the machine jammed and we're, running to get new paper and fix it. And so we actually have this great crumpled fax that came through that we, got and put together.
And you could immediately see that he had checked off basically yes, 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 all the way through, added a couple of great comments.
Bail Organa did this, and Leia was doing this, and it's like, oh my God, this is the absolute source material for this great saga.
One of the main goals LucasArts had when making The Force Unleashed was to have the player feel like a powerful Force user. Part of that can be seen in the choice of Force powers, which I'll discuss later, but those powers wouldn't have had the desired impact if the game engine couldn't do them justice. With that in mind, LucasArts incorporated 3 crucial pieces of middleware into the Ronin game engine that all work together to make the player feel like they really were having a huge effect on the environment and the people in it. Havoc is a physics engine that allows for lots of movable objects, taking into account their mass and size. This meant nearly anything could be picked up and flung around, potentially into other items, causing chain reactions across the screen. Assigning weight to objects meant the heavier items felt and moved differently when Starkiller interacted with them via Force powers. Light items could be flung across the room quickly, although they might get blocked by larger ones. Heavy items might take more effort to move, but would destroy all in their path once you did throw them. Another piece of middleware, digital molecular matter, known as DMM, simulated the substance of molecules to ensure materials behaved similarly to how they did in the real world. For example, glass should shatter, metal should bend, and wood should splinter. The inclusion of DMM meant Starkiller could throw enemies through glass windows and open metal doors by bending them out of his way. Finally, there was Euphoria, the biomechanical AI. True to form, the stormtroopers of The Force Unleashed aren't all that bright, but Euphoria does add an element of self-preservation into the mix, so they will occasionally run and hide. As is often the case when game devs talk about enemy AI, it tends to sound a lot better than it actually is in practice. I don't know about you, but I'm fed up of hearing revolutionary talk about AI, which often gets regurgitated by the game's media, unfortunately, and then it ends up being just flanking, and not even intelligent flanking. I don't think I have footage of this, but I remember in The Division 2, a game people insisted had good AI on the harder difficulties, I would see enemies so determined to flank that they would slowly climb ladders right in front of me. That's not intelligence in my book. From behind the scenes interviews at LucasArts, you can tell the devs are really proud of how the enemies try to grab onto people or objects when you fling them through the air. However, that is largely all there is to it. I don't know whether this is considered a huge leap in AI or if these stormtroopers all just have sticky hands from eating too much candy floss. They still stand around in the open far too often, so when they aren't flying around like ragdolls, there isn't much impressive AI to speak of. When the 3 pieces of middleware all talk to each other, the results can be impressive, such as throwing objects at enemies who then go flying and try to grab hold of something before ultimately going through a glass window into space. The ragdoll enemies do look a little silly, but I like how they feel insignificant and weak compared to Starkiller. In addition to the main version of the game created for PS3, Xbox 360 and PC, The Force Unleashed was also released on PS2, PSP, Nintendo DS and the Wii, with each separate version subcontracted to an outside development team. These other versions were clearly inferior products because they couldn't replicate the physics system that was so crucial to the Force Unleashed experience. However, to partly make up for this, each version did have unique content or modes. For example, the Wii version assigned force powers to the nunchuck that freed up the Wiimote to be used for motion-based lightsaber controls. I haven't played the Wii version, but I'm going to go ahead and assume that those motion controls worked about as well as most of the motion controls on the Wii, i.e. it ended up being little more than a glorified waggle system where you flick your wrist to do everything when it'd be easier to press a button. Other versions contained exclusive levels, for example the PSP version let you play out classic moments from the movies. With all these different versions to oversee, plus the task of incorporating those 3 crucial pieces of middleware, it's not hard to imagine that the team might have been stretched a little thin, even though there were 4 years between initial planning and release. Unfortunately, that conclusion is unmistakable when you play the final product, which in many ways feels like an early alpha build. If you'll excuse the overly technical language, The Force Unleashed feels rough. The game didn't need sort of more playtesting, bug fixing or general QA, it needed more core development. The problems are evident from the moment you first move Starkiller. He doesn't feel connected to the environment at all and his jumps are completely unnatural. The camera is also terrible, so during those rare times when you have to do some light platforming, the combination of an unwieldy jump and a piss poor camera mean your chances of actually landing where you want are slim. Combine this with some terrible checkpoints and you get moments such as this one, where I ended up repeatedly missing this jump and having to repeat 5 minutes of combat just to get another go at it. The recovery time is also incredibly annoying. It's bad enough that Starkiller takes an age to get back on his feet. It's made worse by the fact that you don't regain complete control once the animation is finished. There's this little extra delay for some reason. This means you might not be able to avoid being hit again immediately upon standing up. Combat is functional enough, although I wouldn't go so far as to say that I particularly enjoyed it. With The Force Unleashed, LucasArts went for a Devil May Cry style system, with all Starkiller's lightsaber attacks activated by the press of one button, with the potential to be converted into combos with multiple presses, and different combos available if you start adding in slight pauses between button presses. Starkiller's Force Lightning serves as the ranged option. Unlike Dante's gun, which tends to be more for crowd control and maintaining combos, the Force Lightning is incredibly powerful, and therefore has to be restricted by a Force meter. Even so, it's still far too easy to defeat enemies by keeping your distance, using the lightning, and then waiting for your Force meter to fill up before letting loose again. The combos aren't particularly distinctive, either visually or in terms of damage dealt, so the only real incentive to use them is the additional points reward for using different moves during combat. Each level has a target number of style points to reach, and hitting the target rewards extra XP. This also sounds a lot like Devil May Cry's system, however there is one crucial difference, and that's the lack of a grading system while you fight. Sure, the names of the moves you're doing appear in the top left corner, but without that letter system on the screen it's hard to tell just how stylish you're actually being, especially because the moves aren't all that visually different. While it's possible to unlock aerial moves and juggle combos, these are essentially last on the unlock tree and most people won't get to experience them. It's a shame there's no reason to experiment with all these movesets due to a lack of enemy variety. Actually, that's not really fair. There are a decent number of enemy types, it's just that they don't require different tactics to beat. The 3 things you need to be able to do for basically every fight are mash out your basic 4-button combo for the lightsaber and spam lightning and force push. Here are a few rules of thumb that will get you through most fights. If the enemies are roughly human sized, just spam lightsaber attacks. If they have some sort of shield, then give them a quick push first, then spam lightsaber attacks. Anything bigger than that, use lightning until your force meter is completely drained, and then use the lightsaber while they are stunned. By the time the stun has run out, you might need to dodge an attack or 2, then your force meter will be replenished and you're good to go again. This isn't challenging, but it sure can be tedious. Take the Dark Stormtroopers that are reminiscent of those from Dark Forces. These guys are fairly slow and not difficult to beat, even if there's 2 or 3 of them, but they do have big health bars, which means the fights are slow. It's not worth taking risks and going in for extra attacks because they have a grab move that does a lot of damage, so you end up playing it safe and doing the lightning routine. This even applies to big ATSTs. You can attack them in the air for a bit, but eventually you'll fall to the floor and they will use AoE attacks to push you away. So by far the easiest way to defeat these things is to do that lightning thing. Like I said, this combat isn't really bad. There are a lot of enemies to deal with and you have to do the usual stuff like prioritising those that you think are most dangerous, but it certainly doesn't do anything interesting. There are a decent chunk of force abilities, although it's not so much the number of them that stands out as it is their power. You technically only start off with Force Push and Force Grip, although Force Lightning comes along almost immediately. Force Push and Force Lightning are your staple moves that you'll use all the time and you should level them up as quickly as possible. They also look great, especially when you start incorporating them into aerial combos or rain down lightning from on high. Lightning is especially useful for dealing with big machines like the ATSTs and can even take TIE fighters out in mid-flight. Once upgraded, this can be chained to deal damage to multiple enemies at one time, which is obviously great for crowd control. Force Grip is the power that should be most fun in theory, because it lets you pick items up and fling them around. However, the implementation of this is a disaster due to the incredibly sensitive lock-on system. I say lock-on system, but I'm not sure that name should be used when the lock will break with any movement of the camera or indeed Starkiller himself. You'll often go to pick up the item that is currently highlighted only to grab something different, like an object behind or underneath the one you wanted to grab. Moving the item around requires you to use both analog sticks and it's slow. And even if you do go through all this, when you try to throw the item at an enemy, you'll have no real idea where it will go. Force Repulse is good for getting enemies off you and is again great for crowd control, although I didn't find many situations to use it effectively. The saber throw looks great, although the time required to charge up for big damage means you'll likely just use it as a way to swat enemies out of the air or deal with pesky ones at range. Finally, there is a force shield, which has the added and very useful benefit of adding lightning to your normal lightsaber attacks. Clearly, force push and force lightning are the bread and butter moves. Along with all the lightsaber combos, it's more than enough to feel like a powerful force user, and you get them all early enough that there's plenty of time for upgrades. Short of completely redesigning the game, one thing that might have improved the experience would have been changing this skill unlock system. The current system lets you spend skill points, which are awarded for levelling up but can also be given for getting a certain amount of style points in a level or finding collectibles. You then spend these points in 3 categories: force combos, force powers and force talents, with a point awarded in each category every time you level up. Combos and powers are self-explanatory. Talents are passive bonuses like more health and force meter, or faster regeneration of those bars. Leveling up force powers and talents linked to force ability is clearly the way to go. Being able to chain lightning between multiple enemies is more useful than another combo you might never use. This system is again not dissimilar to Devil May Cry, where you could also level up your guns, which were a secondary ability, and that's kind of the point. They were secondary. The force powers, on the other hand, start off incredibly powerful, and by the end they are godlike and you need strong willpower not to use them. This makes the game too easy, so my suggestion would be to remove the force powers and maybe even the talents from the skill tree and just focus on the lightsaber stuff. Skill points could continue to be spent on combos, but you could also choose to upgrade the damage in a similar way to an existing talent. This doesn't have to be too restrictive. Lightning would still shock things and kill weaker enemies, and a force push is a force push. It would still have utility, it just wouldn't kill enemies on contact. They'd need to be pushed into something explosive or off the edge. The force grip ability lets you grab hold of TIE fighters right from the start. I mean, where do you go from there? The force powers are powerful right out of the gate. It's one of the things I love about the game. But maybe for that very reason, players don't need the opportunity to continuously make them more powerful. As I said, the combat in the Force Unleashed is largely functional. You absolutely can pull off some stylish combos, and I recommend you look up some videos of people doing just that, because in the hands of a skilled player it looks like a completely different game to the one I'm playing. Unfortunately though, I never felt the push to master the Force Unleashed like I used to do with the Devil May Cry games. When the game is good enough, like Devil May Cry 3 in particular, you want to repeat levels just to play more of the game. Being stylish is its own reward. That's not the case with the Force Unleashed. It has the system in place with all the potential lightsaber combos, but it lacks the enemy variety that would demand mastery of those systems, and force powers like lightning and push make for a fun game, but not an especially challenging one. Still, the combat was good enough to keep me ploughing through because, despite being overpowered, there is something obviously fun about swinging a lightsaber, chucking out force lightning, and flinging stuff around with force grip. That said, there is one crucial area where the Force Unleashed completely fails, and that's the boss fights. Most of the boss fights are against other Force users, often powerful Jedi or Sith Lords, so on paper these battles should be epic encounters between light side and dark side powers, and tests of skill for both the player and Starkiller. Imagine the fight with Virgil in Devil May Cry 3, where 2 equally powerful opponents go up against each other in a battle of skill. That is absolutely not how the fights play out in the Force Unleashed. I'm not entirely sure what they were going for with these encounters. They aren't fights of skill a la DMC, they aren't spectacle fights like say God of War, and they aren't puzzle fights like a Zelda game. For most bosses it feels like you're fighting a normal enemy with a bigger health bar and a bunch of cheap attacks. Many of the core problems are common to all boss fights, such as the camera, which perhaps in recognition of its inability to keep up with more hectic encounters, locks itself in place so that you can't move it. And boss attacks feel incredibly cheap. This zoomed out perspective makes it hard to spot details in animations that would clue you into attacks, and even when you do see them they come out quickly. Take for example this attack from Kazdan Paratus. From the start of the animation to the time the attack hits is a third of a second. That's not impossible to react to by any stretch. We also need to consider that 1. Without mods, Force Unleashed runs at 30 frames per second, and 2. I am being incredibly generous to the game with regards to when the animation starts. And given the way he moves and how thin those robot arms are, and how they blend into the environment, you'd be forgiven for not spotting the start of this attack, let alone quickly distinguishing it from other attacks. Kasdan has loads of terrible moves, including some that I'm convinced aren't signposted at all and are essentially unreactable. The Kota fight has a similar problem. Most of his attacks give you closer to half a second to react, but he hardly has any animation tails to react to. It's a shame the melee combat is so unreliable because lightsaber duels are of course one of the most spectacular things to watch in the Star Wars universe, and it would be great to have them play out in a game. This ties into some of the core issues with combat, namely the terrible lock-on. The lock-on is frustrating at the best of times, but even more so when you have this weird camera to deal with. Some bosses like Maris Brood are weak to lightning, but trying to actually hit her with the stuff, even from close range, can be a nightmare. At one point you get to fight Darth Maul. Well, technically it's your droid imitating Darth Maul with a hologram, but beggars can't be choosers, and I was excited to see one of the few good things from Phantom Menace appear in The Force Unleashed. That double-bladed lightsaber of his still looks damn impressive, even if it isn't especially hard to defend against. Unfortunately, Maul seemed to glitch out when I fought him, laying down on the floor and just letting me stab him until he eventually died. On a more minor note, many bosses are seemingly immune to many of your Force powers, although it isn't always clear when or why. For example, I tried to grab hold of Kasdan early on and he always seemed to shake it off, so I gave up and struggled on this fight for a long time. Eventually I tried it again and not only did it work, it seemed to be his main weakness. I can understand why you wouldn't have free reign with your Force powers against bosses. They are also Jedi after all, and it would be a bit too easy if they didn't have some kind of resistance. The problem is the inconsistency. Kota sometimes has a shield of sorts around him, which I thought might be signifying resistance to Force powers, but that wasn't it. Other bosses are much the same. They will sometimes not only block Starkiller's lightning, but even seemingly throw it back at him, while other times they are vulnerable, but there's no indication as to when this applies. It's not even like some bosses are immune to some powers, it's that they are all immune to all the powers some of the time. The big name fights against Vader and the Emperor are especially bad for different reasons. The Vader fight has this awful section where he stands on a small island in the middle and throws things at you with the Force, and these throws are pretty much undodgeable. I did manage to avoid a couple, but that seemed to be more down to luck because there's an insane amount of tracking. You can only jump onto this island to attack him after stunning him, and even then you can only get a few hits in before he throws you off, or tries to throw you off because you can button mash your way out of it. Except he just grabs you again before you hit the floor, but you can button mash your way out of it. Except he just grabs you again before you hit the floor, but you can probably see where this is going. Not very well thought through, this one. Then there's the big fight against the Emperor, which is one of the easiest fights in the game. He throws a bunch of things at you, but there are loads of safe places to hide, and he's kind enough to bring in minions which help regenerate your health. All in all, you get the distinct impression that the big fights weren't especially well thought out. There are few fights you could describe as epic. Outside of the main bosses, the first fight against the Rancor was good, but then they bring loads of them in, with 4 in one relatively confined area, and they end up becoming a bit of a chore. By the time you get to fight Maris Brood's pet Rancor, you know to just casually jump over the charge attacks, hit it a few times, and repeat. To be fair, many of the issues with bosses aren't unique to bosses, they are just more pronounced due to the scale of those encounters. The tougher the enemy, the more you notice the flaws. For example, the Shadow Guards put up a good fight, but they are cheap as all hell. As I was reviewing the footage, I noticed a time when I tried to attack a Shadow Guard who had his back to me. I went to attack and he turned and blocked in one frame. The ATST has a big stomp attack that has an insanely big hit radius. And there are a bunch of minor issues like Starkiller's ground attack not working properly, so more often than not he won't do his little stab move when the enemy is vulnerable, and so on. And that's the issue with all the combat here really. It's not built on any rules, or at least not any obvious, reliable and observable ones. And that means it doesn't feel fair. I suppose one exception to that is the quick time events that pop up on a semi-regular basis. Large enemies like Rancors and ATSTs can be finished off by engaging in a QTE, although in those cases it is optional. You can continue to deplete the health bar normally if you like. All bosses are finished off with lengthy QTE cutscenes where the button prompts bear little or no relation to the events you see depicted on screen. You'll also see some QTEs during boss fights if both Starkiller and the boss happen to use the same attack on each other. For example, they both try to use lightning. This brings up a dial where you have to time 3 or 4 consecutive button presses to win the duel. Sometimes there's no animation to link up the combat with the QTE, which happened a lot in the fight with Kasdan. Playing the footage back, you can see the two characters going from standing there to being engaged in a lightsaber duel in just one frame. I'm guessing the game detected that we both hit attack on the same frame, but it would be nice if there were some animations to link it up. These QTEs are like most QTEs in that they don't add anything to the experience, but are at least largely ignorable for someone like myself who doesn't have any disabilities that would have made this an issue. However, there is one QTE that is truly terrible, and that's the Star Destroyer that Starkiller needs to bring down to inflict a blow against the Empire. This sequence alternates between defeating the TIE fighters flying at you, which is easily done by zapping them with electricity, and then moving the Star Destroyer into position, which is not so easily done. Not at all. There's nothing obviously difficult about the QTEs here. It's not like it's some insanely fast rhythm game where you have to respond to a load of prompts in a short time. We simply need to move the analog sticks as directed on the screen and then hold them in position for about a second when directed to do so. What could be difficult about that? You can only move the ship a bit before another wave of TIE fighters attack, so you will have to repeat this about 4 or 5 times. Still, it sounds easy enough, right? The slight niggle with this QTE is that it doesn't work. The instructions on screen are often wrong, so the game might tell you to rest the sticks in a neutral position, when in fact you still need to push more to the left or right or up or down. You're actually looking for a sweet spot that will light up green on both sticks, but this can be incredibly difficult to pinpoint when you have no idea which direction to move the sticks in. I tried making the smallest movements but often couldn't get it quite right before I had to stop and take out another wave of TIE fighters. Any powerful story beat this moment was trying to bring out was completely lost on me, and I was left feeling like it would have been easier to bring down an actual Star Destroyer in real life. With all its issues around the camera, general movement and sloppy combat system, it's undeniable that The Force Unleashed hasn't aged especially well. It's a AA title which even at release lagged a little behind other games coming out that year such as Dead Space or Grand Theft Auto 4 when it came to recreating large 3D environments. Games changed drastically between 2005 and 2008 as developers started to get to grips with the new hardware, and The Force Unleashed ended up getting caught out by far more polished releases such as Gears of War 2. However, there are advantages to being stuck distinctly in the mid-2000s, and one of them is the idea of including a bunch of free cosmetic items that can be unlocked by playing through the game and getting high scores, or if you didn't want to go to all that hassle you could use cheat codes. And by cheat codes I don't mean your credit card number. Playing the full version of The Force Unleashed now gives you access to all the costumes right off the bat, and there are so many it can be a bit overwhelming. I suppose I shouldn't call them costumes really, because most of them aren't costumes, they're avatars. If you get bored of playing as Starkiller, you can swap him out for a frankly ridiculous number of other characters, many of whom also have multiple costumes. The obvious candidates such as Luke and Han are present and correct, but you can also play as Chewie, Obi-Wan, Grand Moff Tarkin, Qui-Gon Jinn and loads more. Of course they all play exactly the same way, so it's purely a cosmetic thing, but as cosmetic things go it's pretty damn cool. Despite having all these options at my disposal, I didn't use them that often because Starkiller changes outfits anyway as he develops throughout the course of the game, and this visual indicator that he is growing as the story progresses is pretty damn cool, especially when you look appropriately Jedi-esque at the end. It's better than making slight tweaks to the colour of your poncho. That said, I couldn't resist playing a bit as Luke from Return of the Jedi, and I even changed the lightsaber to green so that it felt a little more accurate. This is one of my favourite looks from the original trilogy. Speaking of lightsabers, the different coloured kyber crystals also come with different benefits attached, such as extra style points, more health regen, quicker force recovery and the like. Overall, The Force Unleashed feels a bit like a love letter to the entire franchise at times, almost like the LEGO games in that respect. They will happily let you play as any character in any scenario if it's fun, and to hell with the canon. That's not to imply LucasArts went roughshod over the existing canon for the story, because Hayden Blackman actually did an excellent job creating a story that fits plausibly between episodes 3 and 4, and the first game in particular probably adds weight to the events of the original trilogy, which is not something I can say about many extended universe stories. The Force Unleashed starts with you playing as Darth Vader on Kashyyyk with a full complement of Force powers, except lightning that Vader cannot use. He's on Kashyyyk to track down one of the Jedi who managed to escape Order 66, which is a story beat that's visited a lot in both the Legends stories and the new canon. It makes perfect sense that not all Jedi could have been killed that day, so the idea of Vader getting his hands dirty while he's still proving himself to the Emperor makes complete sense. Vader is about to kill the Jedi when he senses another, more powerful Force user nearby, and assumes it to be this Jedi's master. Seconds later, Vader's lightsaber is ripped from his hand and goes flying straight into the cast iron grip of a child.
I sense someone far more powerful nearby. Where is your master?
The dark side has clouded your mind. You killed my master years ago.
Then now you will share his fate. A son.
Run!
Intrigued, Vader kills the older Jedi and all the Imperial troops who witnessed the event, before kidnapping the child and hiding him away in secret, training him over the years as his apprentice. Fast forward about 2 decades and Starkiller is nearly ready to take on the Emperor, alongside Vader. While the name Starkiller is perhaps now synonymous with the base from The Force Awakens, it's worth noting that Starkiller was the original surname of Luke Skywalker back in early drafts of the movie. It does sound a little ominous, so it's easy to understand why Lucas changed it. However, it's perfect for a Sith apprentice. Starkiller is tasked with completing 3 final tests before being deemed ready, the first of which is to assassinate an old Jedi named General Kota, who is hiding out on a ship above the planet Nar Shaddaa, the homeworld of Aurra Sing. Kota survived Order 66 because he preferred to rely on his own militia instead of clone troopers, and therefore he wasn't with them for Order 66. Starkiller's work for Vader is dangerous, and as such he tends to churn through pilots. He's assigned Juno Eclipse as pilot for this mission. Starkiller is also accompanied by his loyal droid Proxy, who is programmed to try to kill him at any opportunity, thereby keeping Starkiller focused at all times. After killing Kota, Starkiller must kill Kazdan Paratus, an insane droid-obsessed Jedi who has surrounded himself with robot replicas of past Jedi Masters, and then Shaak Ti, who is in Episode 2 and features fairly prominently in the Clone Wars TV series. Having disposed of 3 Jedi, Vader accepts that Starkiller is ready to take on the Emperor. However, Starkiller and Vader never get to enact their plan. The Emperor's spies followed Starkiller to a meeting with Vader, and the Emperor catches the 2 of them scheming. Vader realises his master got the better of him this time and opts to kill his apprentice by stabbing him and launching him into space. You might expect the Emperor to be somewhat upset at Vader's betrayal here, but that's not really the case. In fact, it's pretty much par for the course because that's how the Rule of 2 works. As you probably know, the Rule of 2 states that there must always be 2 Sith Lords, a master and an apprentice. The rule was formally put into place by Darth Bane about 1,000 years before the events of the movies, although the idea of Sith ruling via a master and apprentice can be traced back to the time of the Old Republic. Bane stated that, quote, 2 there must be, no more, no less, one to embody power, the other to crave it, close quote. However, Bane recognised that the Sith would become stagnant if the Master and Apprentice continued to rule until one of them died of natural causes, and there needed to be a succession plan of sorts. To that end, Bane recognised that the Apprentice must at some point challenge the Master. Should the Apprentice defeat the Master, they will become the Master and take on an Apprentice of their own. Typically there's already an Apprentice waiting in the wings. This weird expectation of betrayal can end up being a bit comical. For example, in that Darth Bane trilogy, Bane clearly wants his apprentice Zana to challenge him, and yet he is angry at even the mere suspicion that she is up to something behind his back. Later on, he grows increasingly annoyed that Zana waits for him to become weaker before challenging him, because this makes her a coward for not doing it sooner. It can get a bit circuitous. I think it's a bit like insisting to all your friends that you don't want to do anything for your birthday, but really you do, and you get annoyed if they don't actually plan a surprise party. The point is, Sith Lords expect to be betrayed, and even welcome it in a weird way, because it shows their apprentice is power hungry enough to lead the Sith in the future. The Rule of 2 is partly why the Sith were able to survive over the last 1,000 years, and operate under the noses of the Jedi for so long. This is my long-winded way of explaining why Palps and Vader don't have a big showdown after the betrayal. Of course, Starkiller is not dead. Vader secretly sends out bots to retrieve him, and he is revived. Vader explains that the whole stabbing him with a lightsaber and throwing him into space thing was another part of the deception. After discovering that the Emperor's spies were tracking Starkiller, Vader came up with a more elaborate plan to take the Emperor by surprise. Part of that plan involved appearing to kill Starkiller to throw the Emperor off the scent, and the next step is to create a distraction for the Emperor's spies. That's where Starkiller comes in. Vader instructs Starkiller to get the attention of the rebels and work with them to help take down the Empire by hitting high-value targets. This will consume the attention of the Emperor's spies and allow Vader and Starkiller to spring a trap. Starkiller does as he's told. He first goes after General Kota, who it turns out didn't die during that first mission, although he is now blind and doesn't recognise Starkiller as the man who nearly killed him. Starkiller then rescues Princess Leia and her father Bail Organa before destroying a tower on Kashyyyk that the Empire was using to enslave Wookiees, and then he brings down that Star Destroyer. The rebels certainly have the attention of the Empire now. They gather together to plan the next phase of the attack. However, the meeting is interrupted by Darth Vader, who once again betrays Starkiller and tries to kill him. Vader reveals that the whole thing about infiltrating the rebels to distract the Emperor's spies was actually part of a different plan to locate the rebel leaders and cut down the insurrection before it could truly get started. Vader goes even further and states that this was always the plan. Both the game and the book use language that clearly states the plan in question went all the way back to the moment Vader first met Starkiller as a child, back when he was called Galen Marek. However, I can't believe that's actually the case. It would be stretching things a bit to imply that Vader saw a young child and thought he could train him as an apprentice, then trick him into trying to kill the Emperor, then betraying him and leaving for dead as part of a plan to infiltrate a rebel faction that didn't exist yet. I'm going to go ahead and assume that this part of the plan was only put in place after the Emperor had discovered the initial betrayal. That makes a lot more sense. The Imperials take the rebels as prisoners and Proxy sacrifices his own life to save Starkiller, who is now hell-bent on revenge, having finally accepted that his master betrayed him. Juno and Starkiller head to the Death Star, which is undergoing testing on the 7 separate lasers that will one day combine to blow up Alderaan. The ending plays out much like Return of the Jedi. Starkiller defeats Darth Vader in combat but doesn't kill him. The Emperor then encourages Starkiller to give in to the dark side and execute Vader to take his rightful place at the Emperor's side.
Yes, kill him. He was weak, broken. Kill him and you can take your rightful place at my side. No!
Help him!
You can kill Vader if you like. This isn't the canon ending, however it does tie into some strange pieces of What If DLC where you play through select highly bastardized events of the original trilogy, with Starkiller acting as the Emperor's apprentice to attack the rebels at Hoth and on Tatooine. Other than providing the novelty of fighting against the likes of Luke Skywalker and Boba Fett, these DLCs don't do much interesting. The canon ending sees Starkiller fight the Emperor long enough for the rebels to escape. However, Starkiller dies in the process. There's then a nice epilogue where the rebels discover Starkiller's family crest and adopt it as the symbol of the rebellion that we are already so familiar with. All in all, it's not a bad story by any stretch. I especially like the canon ending and feel Starkiller's sacrifice was appropriate and worthwhile. Ultimately, he couldn't destroy the Empire by himself, we always knew that, but he did inspire the rebellion, and we know how that turned out. It's also interesting to start out playing as a bad guy and even going so far as to kill Jedi. Having the protagonist start off bad and then potentially turn good makes for a more believable ending decision than the one Luke faces in Return of the Jedi. Let's face it, no one ever thought he would turn to the dark side there. Conversely, Starkiller accepted the dark side early on, and he continued to use dark side force powers even after joining the rebellion. While Vader's betrayals may have made him see the folly of the dark side, it's equally likely they would lead to anger, and that isn't an emotion consistent with the light side of the Force. It is understandable he might give in to the dark side and kill Vader to become the new apprentice. That said, I do think LucasArts needed to do more to show Starkiller battling with the conflict, or perhaps incorporate player choice a little earlier. Just before rescuing Bail Organa, Starkiller has the choice to kill Maris Brood, but he lets her live. This might have been a good time to let the player make the choice to help shape their own version of Starkiller. It wouldn't have required much extra work. Really though, I just wanted to see more of Starkiller struggling with the conflict. There's one scene of note where he does, and that isn't handled especially well. Starkiller talks to Vader via a hologram on Proxy. Starkiller clenches his fist in frustration, something Vader picks up on. Juno overhears the conversation and is angry at Starkiller for still working with the man who tried to kill both of them not so long ago. She storms off and Starkiller is left to ponder where his loyalties lie. While this scene does the job in showing Starkiller's conflict, it also feels highly artificial in the way it does so. It seems silly that Starkiller wouldn't try to explain what's going on to Juno after he's been caught. And if Juno really does believe Starkiller is working for Vader, why does she continue to work for him? Why doesn't she inform the rebels that they are walking into a trap? She seems perfectly content to keep working for Starkiller even after finding out this huge news. There are no consequences to her discovering Starkiller talking to Vader. Even later on when she sees Starkiller talking to Vader again, she doesn't demand Starkiller pledge his allegiance one way or the other. She seems happy enough just to carry on and see where things fall. It feels like there's a missing scene in between these two conversations where Juno and Starkiller sit down to talk, and Starkiller explains that he is committed to working for the rebels and he's lying to Vader. He could also talk about how he still feels the constant pull of the dark side and craves the power it can offer. This would do enough to set up the bad non-canon ending. Anyway, another scene with Juno would have been nice because as things stand, I didn't think the kiss just before the final mission was really earned. As a character, Juno is a little underdeveloped in the game, although that problem is mitigated slightly if you read the tie-in novel. Obviously you shouldn't have to do that though. In the books for both Force Unleashed 1 and 2, the chapters generally alternate between Starkiller and Juno, and we get to see why Juno was picked for the mission with Starkiller in the first place and how she was left for dead with Starkiller after Vader's initial betrayal. The book based on the first game is light on details because it attempts to be a strict retelling of the events of the game, and therefore Juno's chapters end up being the story of her waiting around in the ship for Starkiller to come back. There's only so much you can do with that. However, we do find out that she was an excellent TIE fighter pilot who was flying a mission with Darth Vader over Kalos. The mission was successful, however she was still instructed to kill all life on the planet. She casually mentioned that maybe this wasn't necessary because they already had what they needed, and Vader seemed to agree, instead instructing her to hit a power plant. What Juno didn't realise at the time was that destroying the plant in question would have a knock-on effect that would still wipe out all life on the planet anyway. This event clearly planted seeds of doubt in Juno's mind, and it makes it easy to believe she would switch loyalties when asked. Mind you, it does raise the question as to why Vader would pair a seemingly conflicted pilot alongside his prize apprentice, but we won't worry about that. Within the game itself, Starkiller and Proxy are probably the stars of the show, and they make a great pair. I've come to realise lately that I am a sucker for evil droids in the Star Wars universe. My favourite recent example is 000 from the new canon comics, primarily the first volume of Darth Vader and the Dr. Aphra series. I highly recommend checking out these comics if you have the chance. 000 is absolutely phenomenal, and the contrast between him and C-3PO makes it all the sweeter when he gets told he can't torture someone and complains about being torture teased. Proxy isn't quite as good as 000, but he's still amusing, and his sacrifice at the end hits hard, despite or perhaps because of all his previous attempts to kill you. Speaking of which, that moment where Proxy takes on various forms to try and kill Starkiller after he took down the Star Destroyer is one of the few moments that plays out differently in the books. In the books, Proxy is controlled by an evil AI from the ship, so it's not really Proxy trying to kill Starkiller here. The rest of the book follows the game so closely that I can only assume this was a late change to the game's script that simply didn't get picked up in the book. Starkiller is portrayed by Sam Witwer, who was initially auditioned for the role because he looked like Starkiller. In addition to being a passionate Star Wars fan, Witwer is the voice actor of Darth Maul in Clone Wars and Rebels. Plus he has done a bunch of minor voice roles across the television shows and movies. He's even credited in Jedi Fallen Order. He puts in a great performance here and deserves more credit for his role as Starkiller. I know the motion capture isn't as good as more prominent examples, but the voice acting by itself is excellent. LucasArts also did a great job picking side characters for the story and avoided many of the obvious picks, with the exception of Princess Leia. Her role mostly fits well with the existing story, although she might have been better off out of it, because there's now the issue of having to explain why Starkiller never came up in the original movies. You'd think the incredibly powerful Jedi she once knew would get a mention. Other choices are more interesting. Mon Mothma is here as the rebel leader, but best of all we get lots of screen time from the incredible Bail Organa, who I think is one of the better characters in the universe that we haven't spent much time with. Organa is even voiced by Jimmy Smits, so he looks and sounds spot on.
Therefore, let this be an official declaration of rebellion. Today, we all vow to change the galaxy. And one day, the galaxy will indeed be free.
Finally, there's Bel Iblis, who doesn't have the name recognition of the others, but is familiar to those who read the original Thrawn trilogy. Having him here is a subtle level of fan service that I loved. The use of characters across different mediums and different creators was something I always loved about the extended universe. In fact, given this devotion to the Legends canon, I'm surprised LucasArts opted to use these small droids as the enemy that drains Force energy from Starkiller, instead of the Islamari that are so prominent in the Thrawn trilogy. That's only a small point though and doesn't detract from efforts elsewhere. It's little touches like the inclusion of Bel Iblis that endeared fans towards the game perhaps more than they otherwise might have. Despite the mediocre gameplay and lack of character development in the story, you can feel the love and attention to detail shine through to help create something a little better than its separate features might suggest. Sure, having the Star Wars name attached certainly helps, but before EA bought the license there were a lot of Star Wars games and they certainly weren't all good or loved by fans. In some ways the Force Unleashed reminds me of the first Witcher game. It's rough as hell to play, but beneath the surface there's that extra level of care that comes from people who love the source material. That doesn't turn a bad game into a good one, but it can turn a mediocre and otherwise forgettable game into one that people still talk about fondly more than a decade later. And then there's the sequel. Coming 2 years later in 2010, there's no denying that improvements were necessary to the combat system and game engine to, if not match games like God of War 3 and Red Dead Redemption, then to at least close the gap a bit. And the gameplay did improve. Where I described the first game as rough, the second is smooth. Things largely work as intended now. Combat is fast and fluid, the camera is adequate, and the lock-on works properly. It's immediately satisfying and requires little skill to look good. Whereas I gave up on using the Force to throw items at enemies in the first game, here I could do it easily. The game gets out of its own way and uses a bit of common sense when interpreting what it is you want to do. You now have a more generous Force meter as well, so you can throw things around to your heart's content. It's a lot of fun. The first game wanted to be Devil May Cry, but that's a high bar. Not many games capture what makes Devil May Cry special, including some of the Devil May Cry games themselves. You have to work hard to look good playing Devil May Cry. God of War, on the other hand, is more of a spectacle fighter. It's designed to create euphoria from the moment you start playing, and that part is easier to replicate. There's a bit of an Arkham Asylum influence in here as well, as there was with every game from this time period. Enemy types are easy to distinguish, with each requiring particular tactics to take down. Jetpack stormtroopers don't like it when you use your Force lightning to blow the circuits in the jetpacks, for example. Sith Acolyte are invulnerable to Force powers, so you'll need to use your lightsabers when you fight them, and yes, that's lightsabers plural. You have two now. It is a sequel after all. Saber guards are, as the name suggests, enemies that block all your lightsaber attacks, so you have to use Force powers. You get the drift. This all builds towards a system that is insanely fun to play with, for about an hour. After that you've pretty much seen all the game has to offer. Whereas the first game had a lot of different enemy types, even if they didn't require special tactics to take down, the sequel has shockingly few enemies, and with such obvious weaknesses, playing the game becomes mindless. The first game used Devil May Cry's inspiration and was unable to capture what made that series so special, but it turns out copying Arkham Asylum and God of War isn't that easy either. Take those enemies with these specific weaknesses. Arkham Asylum did this a lot as well. New enemy types were constantly popping up and you had to rethink your tactics when fighting them to counter their abilities, such as having to stun them first before attacking. The difference in The Force Unleashed 2 is that the enemies with particular strengths, such as blocking lightsaber attacks, also have glaring weaknesses. In fact, you don't so much think of them as having a strength so much as having a huge weakness. You don't need to rethink your tactics, you just need to use the right attack type on particular enemies. I was always using a mixture of lightsaber attacks and Force powers, so it was no problem for me to target the correct attack on certain enemy types. Hitting jetpack stormtroopers with lightning is a hell of a lot easier than jumping and swinging with the lightsaber anyway, so this is more a case of an enemy type being especially weak to the one attack that you actually want to use. Using the Force Repulse move to kill spiders coming at you in large numbers is easier than trying to kill them all one by one anyway, and they make it easy by surrounding you first. The enemies in Arkham Asylum that needed to be stunned first added an extra step into proceedings. The stun requirement was more work and therefore more of a challenge. In this game the weaknesses just make another option more obvious. There aren't any steps added. Ironically, the improvements to the issues that bugged me in the first game are partly responsible for this one being too easy. For example, the Force grip now works incredibly well. If you want to grab something, chances are you will actually grab the thing you were aiming for. When you want to throw it, chances are you will throw it in the intended direction. I suspect the game is cheating a bit behind the scenes so that even if you aim in the wrong direction it covers for you and does what it thinks you want to do. Games do this all the time and I'm fine with it when it feels this good. Unfortunately there isn't anything to counter how much easier this now useful Force power makes the game overall. Starkiller also has special grab moves that take you out of the action for a few seconds to play out this animation. These moves were probably intended to kickstart combos. One of them even leaves you both in the air so that you can get an aerial combo going. However, I don't think these moves were thought through all that well. Not only are you invincible during the animation, the enemy always ends up on the floor if you don't attack in the air, which means Starkiller can perform an execution. There's no limit on how often you can use this move either, so if you want, you can just walk up to every enemy, initiate the grab, and then stab them on the floor. This makes a mockery of some of the supposedly more challenging enemies. The level design also contributes to the lack of challenge. Large chunks of the game take place on elevated platforms of some kind, and it's incredibly easy to push any basic minion off the edge. Occasionally I just ran around spamming force push to clear a path. This move doesn't use much force power because I guess it's seen as a low damage move, which is technically true I guess. They say it's not the fall that kills you but the ground, so yeah, I guess the force push isn't a one-hit kill button, but it sure acts that way. Those QTEs are back and again used to finish off the larger enemies. This time however the button prompts are on the four edges of the screen depending on which button is being represented. While I understand the thinking behind this, it can be tricky to keep your eyes on the entire screen when you're supposed to react quickly to a random prompt. The QTEs are a touch more appropriate to what's happening on screen this time, such as mashing a button to push back a group of missiles, but ultimately you're still just mashing a button. You can actually catch missiles in mid-flight now and send them back where they came from, or even deflect them with a well-timed parry. It's a great addition and makes fighting the larger machines less tedious. The Force Unleashed 2 adds a new force power called Mind Trick, which you can use to trick enemies into fighting on your side. It's not a bad move to use when you're overwhelmed, but given the time it takes to do the trick and the number of enemies you have to deal with, it doesn't make a lot of difference. All considered, you're almost always better off using a different power. The upgrade tree has been greatly slimmed down, and you now acquire upgrades by spending something more akin to a currency instead of skill points. You can still upgrade damage dealt, but most passive bonuses have been removed, as have the combos, leaving just upgrades to force powers to spend your points on. As with the first game, this feels like a huge misstep because the force powers are already so strong. You can upgrade the powers so that lightning stuns people, grip can throw more objects, push is more powerful, etc. But none of the upgrades change the way you play the game at all. They actually felt like passive abilities really, because I didn't notice any difference. Lightsaber combat remains largely an exercise in button mashing. It does feel better at first due to factors like a working lock-on and parry system, and the double lightsaber setup is fun, but it doesn't even pretend to incorporate player skill this time, and the hit detection is still balked. Just to show I'm not being biased, this completely goes both ways, with enemies sometimes missing you despite swinging right through you. The boss fights are strongly reminiscent of those in God of War, except they're nowhere near as good. They also last longer than an extended cut of a Hobbit movie. These things drag on far past the point where they have worn out their welcome. Little skill is required. Most of the fights, and there are only a handful, are glorified quick-time events that require so little skill or input it can be hard to stay focused. You fight a large Gorog over multiple stages, starting off in a gladiator arena, then on top of it, and eventually while falling through the air, in a fight that is reminiscent of one from the new God of War game, come to think of it. Still, there's no sense of danger nor any interesting challenge, so I was praying for it to end. The worst boss fight is saved for the end when you confront Darth Vader. You move from platform to platform, occasionally engaging Vader in button mashing contests, while fighting off waves of clones of yourself. Vader has 3 health bars and the contest lasts ridiculously long. Again, there's no challenge as such, although you can die if you get unlucky with the location Vader decides to drop you. He likes to hang out by the edge of these platforms, so if he holds you in the air and then drops you, there's a good chance you'll awkwardly fall off and die. If you do, you have to replay a huge chunk of the fight, even though there are plenty of good moments that checkpoints could have kicked in, and there's absolutely no merit in making you replay parts of the fight. Your health isn't an issue because you constantly get more from all the clones, so there's no point making you slog through parts of the fight multiple times. It really is remarkable how boring a fight with Darth Vader can end up being. So yeah, I guess Force Unleashed 2 is an example of be careful what you wish for, because on the face of it, this combat was exactly what I wanted from the sequel, and it felt immediately satisfying, before the novelty wore off and I realised that there was no challenge. Fighting became rote. I would see an enemy and press the corresponding attack button for whatever they were weak to. It wasn't exactly stimulating. Credit where it's due though, because given the unbelievably short development time, I'm amazed LucasArts managed to make any changes to the combat system, let alone significant ones. A 2-year gap between games is short, but not inherently all that unusual. However, it's been reported that the actual development time was a lot shorter, perhaps closer to a year. The graphical upgrade alone is miraculous and still looks incredible now. There's nothing dated about these visuals. The entire structure of the second game was developed on the basis of what unused assets are left over from the first game. This obviously led to the levels being rather uninspired and short. Ridiculously short, in fact. I'm one of those people who rallies against games that are overly long for the sake of being long, and I love shorter games for the more refined experience they can offer, but that's not the case here. The Force Unleashed 2 feels like a game that should be around 10 to 12 hours, so that players can learn new abilities and become increasingly powerful and adept, not to mention experience an engaging story, and yet my playthrough came in at under 5 hours. And that's not me rushing by any stretch. I even got stuck in a few spots and had to repeat content due to the game crashing a couple of times. Remarkably, the game even manages to feel padded out at that short runtime. For example, while in the first game you could force push doors open quickly, the sequel often makes you slowly pull them open instead. It also uses large empty rooms for combat and then splits them up into sections for you to work your way through one at a time, killing waves of enemies. It's the dictionary definition of uninspired. A short game might at least offer some replay value, but I don't see any here of note. You'll probably get all the powers you need in one playthrough, and given the lack of challenge on offer, there's really no point in playing twice. The length and lack of challenge actually go hand in hand. Presumably if the game had been double the length or more, LucasArts could have introduced new abilities such as mind control and the ability to send bolts of lightning down your lightsaber a bit later on, and had progression be more meaningful. Instead there's no time for that, so you're basically given it all off the bat and told to go nuts. The development time limitation is also not conducive to good storytelling. I've long moaned about the tendency in the video game industry to not get writers involved earlier, resulting in game designers crafting the story beats, locations and major battles, and leaving the writers to link it all together at the end. The first Force Unleashed game didn't do that. Blackman had 18 months to work on the story. He was able to partake in auditions for the voice actors, hear early drafts of the recordings, and suggest changes as the game came together.
Was the what is your bidding, my master? Is just the we talked about this last time too. Just putting a little more venom on that.
On my master?
Yeah, on the my master.
For the sequel, that 18-month time frame was reduced to 3 weeks. I'm going to discuss the story shortly, and like many of you, I think it's a bit of a disaster. But as I critique it, always bear in mind that this was made in 3 weeks. Not only that, it was made in 3 weeks with the full knowledge that it would need to recycle the same characters and locations. Blackman didn't even want to tell another story about Starkiller. Starkiller's story had finished. The original plan for the sequel was to have Yoda as the protagonist, which would have been so damn perfect. Logistically, this might have been tricky, which is maybe why they abandoned it. For example, Yoda would have to move fairly quickly to keep up with human-sized enemies, which means those little legs of his would be a blur, but still, I mean, it would have been cool. Instead, we got a clone of Starkiller. Maybe. He's presented as a clone at the start, with Vader growing a bunch of Starkillers until he can get one that is obedient enough. Skipping to the end quickly, I don't think Starkiller is a clone. I think Vader somehow brought him back to life after the events of the first game and is using him as the basis for more clones, but he hasn't yet mastered the process. We see at the end how Vader is growing a lot of clones, but they are all a little mad and nowhere near as powerful as our Starkiller. Kota also points out later on that it is impossible to clone a Jedi. This point is really hammered home in the book with a discussion of previous attempts by the Kaminoans to clone Jedi and how those attempts all ended in failure even though Kaminoans are the experts in cloning. Broadly, the overarching story of The Force Unleashed 2 is significantly less interesting than that of the first. It's essentially just a hunt for Juno, although that does happen to coincide with some major goals for the rebellion such as capturing Darth Vader. Starkiller starts off conflicted, not really remembering his prior life, which is supposedly a result of the cloning process. Vader puts him through a test to see if he is ready, but Starkiller fails when it comes to killing a projection of Juno. He is consumed by a desire to be reunited with her, so he flees Kamino in a fast-paced and fairly enjoyable escape scene, and ends up following a lead to Kota, who he believes may know where Juno is. You join forces with Kota to fight that huge Gorog. While I don't like the fight as a whole, I do like the Gorog's entrance, which does a good job establishing the sheer enormity of the thing. After they escape, Starkiller decides the next step should be a trip to Dagobah because Kota offhandedly mentioned it and for some reason it stuck in Starkiller's mind. That's the Force for you, I guess. On Dagobah, he of course meets Yoda and has a vision similar to Luke's where he sees Juno standing on the Bridge of the Salvation, which is then attacked. Kota and Starkiller head to the Salvation, but they're too late. Juno is captured by Boba Fett and taken away on Slave 1. They do, however, find a restored version of Proxy. There's another silly boss fight here against a large machine where you need to remove a bunch of power cells from the wall before you can get some attacks in, and then for some reason you need to put them back in again. Anyway, the Salvation arrives at Kamino where it was heading anyway as part of a large rebel attack. However, the battle does not go well because the rebels can't get past the planet's defences. The only way to take out the shields is to fly the Salvation into the shield generator, which Starkiller does using the Force, jumping out of the ship at the last second. These little freefall moments are repeated way too often. While it can be fun to switch your brain off every now and again and let events wash over you, like you need to do when watching The Rise of Skywalker, by the time you've done this 3 or 4 times the novelty has well and truly worn off. Once on Kamino, Starkiller is confronted by all those inferior clones of himself, and eventually he fights Vader. During the final phase of this fight, Starkiller activates his Force Rage ability, which was the first time I'd actually used it after the tutorial. I'd completely forgotten all about it because the game was so easy. You don't need it for the fights against minions, and the big boss battles tend to be done in strict phases, so going all supernova doesn't help a lot. This scene is equal parts spectacular and messy. Once again, there's no skill involved and the camera and frame rate struggle to keep up with the action, but given the title of the game, it's appropriate to end with the Force being unleashed in such spectacular fashion. Vader gets the upper hand and demands that Starkiller kill Kota in order to save Juno's life. Juno is able to break free and attacks Vader, but he reacts in time to fling her away. The distraction is enough for Starkiller to take control and defeat Vader. Kota stops Starkiller from delivering the final blow, stating that Vader is more valuable as a prisoner than dead. At this point you have a choice, although it's nowhere near as meaningful as the one in the last game. The non-canon ending sees Starkiller try to kill Vader, but one of the clones kills Starkiller first. The canon ending sees you spare Vader and take him captive. It's an incredibly disappointing story on nearly every level. The ending is nowhere near as impactful for a start. Whereas the first game ended definitively and in keeping with canon as Starkiller died to inspire the rebellion, the second game has an open ending and not an especially interesting one. We know that Vader escapes, and presumably it's Boba Fett who frees him, since we see him hanging around at the end. Vader in captivity can't really play out in any way that builds on the original stories either. In fact, he needs to be released pretty quickly because the events of the first film are not far off. This makes the events of this game largely pointless. There also isn't much of a character arc for anyone of note. Starkiller changes ever so slightly as he confronts the possibility he's a clone and what that means. Plus he ultimately decides to work for the rebellion, whereas during the game he made a point of saying he was only working with them to the extent it furthered his goal of saving Juno. This is a character arc, but that doesn't make it inherently interesting. We saw a similar problem with Finn in The Last Jedi. People use this arc to defend his role in the movie. And it's true, this is an arc, but that doesn't make it entertaining to watch. Having an arc be a character going from, I want no part of the resistance to, I will join the resistance, is perfectly legitimate. But if you have the character work with the resistance for an entire movie, or game in this case, it becomes a lot harder to sell this again as an arc that viewers will care about a second time. I could talk about why The Last Jedi is a bad movie all day, but I'll end it there. I don't really want to add to the vitriol around characters like Rose when you've got ridiculous situations like the actor playing her has already been hounded off social media. It should be possible to critique the movie and the characters without things getting personal, but ultimately in the case of The Last Jedi, the two things are practically inseparable at this point. Anyway, back to The Force Unleashed 2. Juno isn't involved much despite being Starkiller's main motivation. For around half the game she is in places unknown, and then once Starkiller locates her, she gets kidnapped and has to be rescued. This is where the tie-in novels really come into their own, because in the book for the second game, Juno has a huge role in bringing the rebels together and getting a fleet of ships large enough to attack Kamino in the first place. She plays a diplomat role of sorts, similar to Princess Leia. She visits the homeworld of the Mon Calamari to recruit Akbar into the Alliance, and even stages an attempted kidnap of Grand Moff Tarkin. I guess Sean Williams was given license to go nuts on this novel due to the lack of story on offer in the game, and he came up with something pretty special. The fact that the story can progress naturally instead of having 90% of it be a description of Starkiller walking through levels and killing things sure helps. What works as a game doesn't always work as a novel, and the first book was at times a tedious and dry experience. The second novel proves the opposite. What doesn't work as a game can work as a novel. Starkiller still isn't especially interesting, but Juno's character development makes for a decent read, and the book manages to stand alone as an interesting story in its own right. In fact, if you haven't played the game and just want to experience the story, I would actually recommend reading the book over playing or watching the game. Clearly the complete story of Force Unleashed was never finished, and now likely never will be, barring a huge about turn from Disney. It is a shame that LucasArts never got to finish what it started. The first game had a decent story but was awkward as hell to play. The second game made huge leaps forward in the gameplay but didn't have the time to build a complete game around those new mechanics or implement a good story. As I stated earlier, I would have preferred to get a Force Unleashed 3 over Jedi Fallen Order, although plans for a third game were a little uninspired. LucasArts wanted to make the third game more expansive with perhaps an open world, and had ideas for co-op gameplay that would have fit nicely into the proposed story, which saw Starkiller team up with Vader and actually fight alongside him this time to take down the Emperor. Frankly, this all sounds horrendous, although the game never got out of the early design phase, so it's not worth dwelling on. Assuming we were to play as Starkiller again, I would have liked to see him deal with a different threat entirely, like maybe tracking down Darth Maul or someone like Thrawn. I suppose when I say I want a Force Unleashed 3, what I'm really saying is I want another game in the style of Force Unleashed as opposed to what we got with Jedi Fallen Order. I want a game that lets me unleash the power of the Force instead of reluctantly giving me Force powers and then holding back in every possible way. Respawn felt burdened by the Force and ended up using it largely as a gimmick for its Metroidvania elements. The Force can and should let the player do so much more than pull a rope towards them or hold a platform in place. Jedi Fallen Order played things so unbelievably safe that it ended up feeling like a missed opportunity. Yes, it plays a hell of a lot better than The Force Unleashed, especially the first one, but it feels so utterly forgettable. I didn't record any footage from my initial playthrough, so I'm going to have to go back and play it more to grab relevant footage for this video, but I absolutely cannot be bothered. It's so incredibly okay. My time with Jedi Fallen Order made me want to go back to The Force Unleashed, a game I remembered fondly from over 10 years ago. I cannot for 1 second imagine playing a game in 2030 and being inspired to go back and make a video on Jedi Fallen Order. I don't even want to make one on it now, it's too bland. The Force Unleashed could be a chore to play at times, but you can never use the word bland to describe the experience. I hope whoever makes the next Star Wars game that sees you play as a Force user actually wants to make a game about a Force user and doesn't just do it because that's the corporate mandate. Hell, there's no need to have Force users at all. A lot of Star Wars stories outside the movies are centred around non-Force users, and I think the cancelled 1313 was going in that direction. All I ask is that if you do play as a Force user, have them actually use the Force in fun ways, not as glorified keys to access new areas. Or maybe instead of making an all-out action game, EA makes a Star Wars RPG like Knights of the Old Republic. Please, EA? Not BioWare though. Ta. Alright, that's it from me today. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to see more Star Wars content, then please hit like, subscribe and share the video where appropriate. As I mentioned earlier, it would be cool to see people discuss their favourite Star Wars stories outside of the movies, regardless of whether those stories are official canon or not. Let's have the comments be one big list of stories for people to explore if they are disenchanted with the new movies. And let's face it, most of us are at this point. The next video should be another isometric CRPG video. It won't be the normal style though. Instead of covering one game in detail, I'm going to go over a couple of games in slightly less detail and talk about the dark ages of isometric CRPGs. After that there will be more Splinter Cell and, assuming all goes to plan, The Witcher 3. Okay, thanks for watching. Until next time, cheers.